Hey guys, I am going to take you through a little bit of information about persuasion, ethos, pathos, and logos, and some of the ways to connect to your audience in a persuasive speech. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up our slides so we can get started. So, persuasive speaking is a very important skill. We've already mastered informative speaking, but there's a few things that make persuasive speaking a little bit different. So we're going to go through these right now. So the first thing, persuasion can go through obstacles that force cannot. I'm starting us out with that quote just to remember the importance and the power of persuasion. So it may feel difficult to figure out what could people care about right now during a time of shelter in place and with coronavirus, and maybe you're presenting about something different. It's important that we still maintain our passions and realize the power of persuasion. So my goal is that by the end of at least a few slides of information, you have a better understanding of how to persuade people about the things that you really care about. So let's get started by looking at what persuasion is and how we come across it. So what does it mean to be persuasive, and how do we encounter persuasive tactics every day? We do encounter persuasion every day. Even if we're at home and shelter in place, there's a good chance we're still being persuaded by different messages. One, we're being persuaded to stay at home, and we're being persuaded to engage in hand washing, limiting touching our faces, social distancing, all of those things. But what does it mean to be persuasive? Persuasion is the use of appeals to reason, value, beliefs, and emotions to convince a listener or reader to think, feel, or act in a particular way. So that's going to be your goal with the persuasive speeches, is to get your audience to think, feel, or act either differently or in a particular way that's relevant to the topic you are persuading us on. So picking up from your informative presentations, you're now taking that information and not necessarily telling us just the information about it, but what we should do about it, how we should think about it, and how we should feel about that information. So that's going to be your goal moving forward. There's a lot of examples of persuasion. If you're at home watching TV, you're probably being bombarded by advertisements. Even if you're on social media, as you scroll through, you probably see a host of advertisements. Advertising is one of the ways that we are persuaded constantly. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But an interesting exercise that you can do at home during shelter in place is, as the advertisements come up, look at them. Think about what's persuading you in these advertisements and what isn't. What is it that's really standing out? Which are the ones that you stop for? Which are the ones that you're thinking about later on? Maybe you're scrolling through Instagram, you see an advertisement for a dog bed, and then a few weeks later you're like, oh, that dog bed on Instagram looks really cool, maybe I should get that. And now there's an advertisement coming up that, like, oh, this dog bed's 20% off. You can see that that's a lot of persuasion, right? Maybe they have a cute video that persuades you to think about it. You're still thinking about it later, and then now, oh, price cut. So you can see there's a lot of different things that are done to persuade people. So as we move through our online and virtual world, pay attention to the advertisements you come across and see what persuades you and what doesn't. Aristotle defined rhetoric as an ability in each particular case to see all the available means of persuasion. So what this means is that there's a whole host of ways that you could potentially persuade someone for any given topic. So once again, if I'm persuading someone to buy that dog bed, I could show pictures of cute dogs in that dog bed. I could talk about how it's more ergonomic or something like that. I could talk about the price. Maybe it's the last dog bed I would ever need to buy, something like that. There's a lot of ways that we can persuade. Part of our job as persuasive speakers is figuring out what's going to be the best way to persuade this audience. So I have an example argument for us here, an example challenge. Let's say that I am starting with an audience who thinks that dogs are better than cats. And my goal is to get the audience by the end of my presentation to start thinking that cats are better than dogs. So how can we get there? We're going to examine a few different tactics that maybe we could employ. So we're going to look at ethos, pathos, and logos. You've probably heard of these a little bit before, but we're going to talk about them more in terms of when preparing a persuasive speech, how to have these be effective. So the first one is ethos that we're going to cover. Ethos is often referred to as an appeal to authority or an appeal to credibility. What it means is that we are influenced by that person, and this could be based on a whole host of things. So the example down here is Bill Gates. He's generally seen as a pretty well-read person, someone who's pretty smart. He has a lot of money. He's been very successful. People take what he says to heart. So let's say he has a point of view about coronavirus. Maybe you're more likely to listen to what Bill Gates has to say than maybe your friend or your neighbor or something like that who just kind of has a crazy idea. We're influenced by the person themselves. And so that's what the first part is up here. A person is influenced by the writer or speaker's character or image as shown in their syntax, voice, attitude, and presentation. This also addresses that if we find someone likable, we're more likely to listen to what they have to say. If someone comes across in a way that seems either, I don't know, maybe curt or short, or we just don't get along with that person, we're less likely to be persuaded by their message. Whereas if someone seems friendly and open and engaging, we're more likely to listen and then also to be persuaded, especially if we can find things in common with that person. And there's another aspect to this too. So Aristotle called it the moral rightness of an argument. And what this means is it connects down here to the idea that if the speaker has good sense, good moral character, and goodwill, we are inclined to believe what they have to say. So more than just liking this person and thinking that they're credible, we have to feel that they have our best interest in mind in order to be persuaded by them. So that's something that for us as speakers, we can establish with our credibility statement and in the persuasive speech by addressing any stories or, interactions that you've had with the topic. If I'm persuading about beach cleanups, I can talk about the beach cleanups I've helped coordinate, all the different ones I've been a part of, maybe show pictures. You get a sense that, one, I'm really knowledgeable about the topic. And the other thing you want to think about is how you connect the topic of the speech to the audience and the relevance. If we feel like it's really important for us to listen and that it matters to us whether we take action, we're more likely to be persuaded. So that's a little bit about ethos. The next one we're going to examine is logos. So this is an appeal to logic. So Aristotle says that this is the most important of the three. However, we want to use all three in balance. So don't get too carried away with logos, but I'll talk a little bit more for our next class session about how we're going to incorporate logic through the design and the creation of our argument and how it's structured. What we want to cover right now for logos is the idea that your argument is based on reason, that it sounds logical. It's compiled of logical arguments, and it's persuasive because it is true and it seems true. You have credible sources. You're using information that's well-founded. So what you want to do when you're creating your persuasive speech is find good, credible data that supports the logic of your argument. So once again, if I'm talking about beach cleanups, I would want to have a lot of logical data to show that beach cleanups are needed and that they're detrimental to our health and our safety, and so we need to have them. Maybe I'd give statistics about the amount of plastic or trash in the oceans, things like that, or on the beaches. And maybe I would talk about the impacts that having plastics in our oceans can have on people who eat seafood, right? Things like that. Then it becomes a lot more logical. And we see that this is a necessary argument, so we're more inclined to listen. And lastly, we have pathos, which is appeals to emotion. So this is the use of emotional appeals to get the audience to accept one's viewpoint. It is intended that the message inspire followers. A common use of pathos in argument is to create a sense of rejection if the audience doesn't agree. So I have a picture down here of a cute puppy that says, "Please adopt me." So as I said, as you're looking at all the commercials that surround you, whenever there's an animal in a commercial, there's a good chance that they're heavily relying on pathos or an appeal to emotion to make their persuasive claim. We see animals and they kind of tug on our heartstrings. They're kind of that fast track to our emotions in a sense. We also see appeals to a variety of emotions. It can be sadness, happiness, anger, fear. And so this idea down here, that sense of rejection, if the audience doesn't agree or doesn't take action, right? Maybe you can see commercials about bad breath, that maybe you'll be socially ostracized if you have bad breath or things like that, or you'll be shamed by it. You won't be able to, find that person that you want to be with, all because of your bad breath, right? And so you can see that this gets overplayed sometimes, and it's because when it's done right, it can be a quick, kind of shot to the heart for some of us and really get our message through quickly. You want to be careful not to overuse any of these, though. We're all going to connect more strongly to one of these three areas, and so it's important that you use them in balance to connect to a wider variety of your audience. For instance, pathos appeals can be very effective for some of us, but not for all of us. Some of us might be turned off by appeals to emotion. That might make us think the speaker is less credible. So it's important that you realize whatever you're sharing with us is in balance and that it's effective and purposeful. You don't want to just throw these in there just to have them. They should be intentional and purposeful. So coming back to our argument about trying to get an audience that thinks dogs are better than cats to think cats are better than dogs, there's a few things to think about. First of all, the idea that this is a spectrum, right? I have a cat and a dog, and I love them both equally. So I probably land in the middle, and I probably won't be persuaded one way or the other. And you may be in some position where maybe you just love dogs or you just love cats, but it's important to realize that it's always going to be a spectrum, and that usually we're not all on one side or all on the other side. So some things I could do, I could appeal to credibility. Maybe Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer, has something that where he says cats are better, right? And you're like, wow, Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer, thinks cats are better. Maybe I should reconsider. Maybe I have a lot of logical data that shows that cats are more cost effective, and I connect this to how college students need stress relievers, of which cats can be a great stress relief. Their purring can be calming and things like that, and they are more cost effective and easier to care for than dogs. And then maybe I have a picture of cute cats just to kind of show like, oh, look how cute these cats are, right? Kind of that tug on the pathos element too. Now, I don't know that this would fully persuade any of you, but you can see how these start to work and they start to get you to think more critically about what it is that you're sharing. So there's some other things that we can do to try to persuade our audience too. One of those is to say something that no one can rightfully disagree with. Now, what does that mean? That would be super easy, right? We're going to look at a term called ideographs, and this is by rhetorician Michael McGee. This is something that he coined and is used quite a bit. And we're going to look at how these can be a very effective way or a tool to help persuade your audience. So what the heck is an ideograph? Maybe you haven't heard of that word before, and I wouldn't blame you. Ideographs are one-term sums of an ideology that have an either overtly positive or overtly negative association. And so what that means is they are words that conjure up a lot of connotative ideas that help us connect more quickly to an idea. So here's some examples. Freedom, love, equality, peace, friendship. We are very likely to think all of those things are good things, right? And hate, we're very likely to think that hate is a bad thing. If you can connect your argument to one of these terms or these ideologies, then you might be more easily able to persuade your audience. So let's look at some campaigns that utilize these. The pro-choice and pro-life movement is probably one of the hallmark examples of capitalizing on the use of ideographs to frame their messaging. They're not called pro-abortion and anti-abortion, they're called pro-choice and pro-life because we like choices. If you're now in a position to argue against the pro-choice movement, it's like, wait, you don't like choices? You don't like freedom, right? It positions you in this strange way. And even more so with pro-life. You don't like life? What? You're pro-death? How could you be against life, right? And so you see that it takes these really complex arguments and connects them to more simplistic ideas that is more adaptable and more easily adopted by the audience to be persuasive. So I'm going to post some commercials below this, and I want you to see if you can identify the ideographs in those commercials. So that's something that you'll be responding to in Canvas. So now you know what an ideograph is, and I want you to try to pull some out of that commercial. So the other thing, and I kind of addressed this when we talked about our getting our audience to think cats are better than dogs argument, is that you can only persuade those who are capable of being persuaded. You're not going to be able to persuade everyone in your audience, and it would be a mistake to even focus on the people who disagree with you the most. So there's a quote down here: you can give a person knowledge, but you can't make them think. Some people want to remain fools only because the truth requires change. Change is hard, and sometimes it's hard to confront the fact that maybe we've been doing something wrong, maybe even all of our lives, and maybe it's a little bit more difficult to make that switch. This is from the Yale Climate Change Program from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Science, and this is a little bit older of a 6 Americas audience segment. So what this is the Yale School of Climate Change takes the American population, surveys people to get a sense of where they land in their belief about climate change. So people who are alarmed think it's happening and impacting us greatly and that we need to be very concerned. People who are concerned, it's something that they think about. They're probably about to make some lifestyle changes or are trying to wherever it's convenient, but they're not quite to the extent of those who are alarmed. People who are cautious think like, I think something's going on, but I'm not quite comfortable enough to do something about it. People who are disengaged, you just don't even know what it is. You're not even a part of it. It's not even on your mind or your radar at all. People who are doubtful are like, climate change, that sounds fishy. I don't know about that. And people who are dismissive are like, absolutely not. There is nothing happening about climate change. So the reason I put this up for you is just to show you a spectrum on a political topic for you to get a sense that usually more people are kind of in the middle. The people on either end are usually less of the population. So it's important that you frame your messages to really focus more on the people in the middle. It's going to be a lot easier to, let's say, move someone from disengaged to cautious or from cautious to concerned than it would be to get someone who's dismissive to suddenly be alarmed. That's probably not going to happen in an 8-minute speech, but at least you can maybe get some of the people in the middle to think a little bit more differently, or maybe some of the alarmed people to take more actions than they're already taking. And the other thing that you want to do is you want to try to make your speech very personal. You want to try to connect to local events, things that we're feeling right now. So if you can connect to, for instance, the social distancing, shelter in place that's going on, it might connect a little bit more strongly to the audience. If you can connect to things that are happening in California or maybe even in Santa Cruz County, it's going to be more likely that we'll be persuaded by the information that you share. And additionally, making your information very relevant. So this is an older graph. This is from 2010, but this shows people's water bills. So let's say that I have this, this is my image and I'm talking about California water systems. If that's the case, I would want to have concrete information that talks about the cost of water and how it could potentially go up if we don't mindfully use our water sources, right? Because then it's relevant. If we have to pay more for something that we need to survive, then we're going to be concerned. And lastly, the other thing you want to shoot for in your persuasive speeches is making it impossible to ignore. And so this was a news story that talked about how water became poisoned in some areas of California. And once you hear that your water could be contaminated or poisoned, yes, it's impossible to ignore, right? Because once again, we need water to survive, or at least coffee, which is made by water. So some of the things that we have covered today are ethos, pathos, and logos. So remember, ethos is those appeals to credibility, pathos is those appeals to emotion, and logos is those appeals to logic. We also talked about ideographs, how you can use those one-term sums of an ideology to try to persuade people kind of with an ideology they already hold, just connecting your idea to that ideology. We also talked about that spectrum of acceptance, right? you're not going to be able to persuade every person. So you want to think about who you're going to be able to persuade and what's the best way to persuade them. You also want to make your topic personal, relevant, and lastly, impossible to ignore. So when we come back next class, we're going to be addressing Monroe's motivated sequence and how to structure our persuasive messages to get a little bit more information about logos. And that's it for today. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing what you submit and watch the next video for our next class. All right, bye.